and thank you for joining our Intro to Organizational Design conversation and webinar. We're really excited to have you all here and to share some of the really wonderful frameworks uh, and themes we have around organizational design from a regenerative perspective today. I'm going to invite you all to start with just a little bit of grounding. So whatever time it is where you are, whatever it is you've been doing before this, let's just take a minute for you to get settled in the room you're in this virtual space that we're in together. And yeah, just take a minute. You can close your eyes, put your feet on the ground if that's helpful for you, and just take a couple deep breaths. We might be arriving here from all over the place, from different time zones, even different countries or continents. But at least for many of us, the places that we are calling in from, the land that we are calling in from is land that was stolen through violence, through genocide in some cases. And no amount of words can do justice or repair that harm. But our hope today is that in our gathering and the good that comes out of our gathering is one small and humble step towards returning our relationship as humans and to the land to a sense of balance and a sense of harmony that those original land stewards had and continue to have. And if you are calling in from Turtle Island, from North America, there's a great website called nativeland.ca where if you don't already know, you can find who those original indigenous stewards are and do work to start to build solidarity and repair that harm. Okay, so my name is Adam Brock. I am with Regenerate Change. We're an organization that supports change makers in designing holistic transformation in their personal lives, in their organizations and causes. We do that through education, like this webinar today. We do that through consulting and resourcing with individuals and organizations. And we do that through network weaving. I'm guessing most of you got to this through our Mighty Network, which is our online platform for network weaving, and really encourage you all to explore that if you haven't already. So first, we're going to start with regenerative social design, which is a little bit more broad than just the organizational design. And that's the overall kind of framework that we use at Regenerate Change, regenerative social design. So what is regenerative social design? What we say is it's applying patterns from nature. So the more than human world, really understanding that more than human world, applying that understanding to consciously design the personal and interpersonal conditions for all humans to thrive. So that could look like a lot of different things. And this is a framework we use that Abra has developed that we call nested holes to kind of talk about that. At the core of regenerative social design is the self. And Abra has been giving some great educational workshops and webinars on what we call personal regeneration, applying these frameworks to our own lives. And then as we apply those frameworks to our own lives, we can start to apply them at that next level out at a group. Maybe this is your roommates or your family. Maybe this is people who you work with really closely or your group of friends or collaborators. And then as we apply those frameworks on that kind of group of 3 to 12 people, then we can apply it to larger systems. And that's kind of the level that we're going to be talking at today, somewhere between the group and the system. But it gets even bigger than that, right? Because systems are part of a culture as a whole. And as we start to infuse our institutions and our larger social systems with these regenerative paradigms, we can actually start to change the culture as a whole. And that's our theory of change. So again, that's the big picture of regenerative social design. So where does regenerative organizational design fit into that? Regenerative organizational design is about applying patterns from nature to create and nurture purpose-driven organizations. And so what do I mean by a purpose-driven organization? Some of you might be familiar with the permaculture ethics: care for people, care for ecosystems, equitable resource distribution. Or you might have heard the phrase triple bottom line, which is about caring for people, caring for the planet, and making a profit while doing so. Essentially, any organization, and when I say organization, this could be a nonprofit, it could be a for-profit, it could be a government agency, it could just be a loose association of people who are coming together to make a change. Either way, any organization, any group of people who are doing something to heal, something for healing, something for justice, something for regeneration. And so regenerative organizational design is about any of those groups that I just named applying patterns from nature to do that work well. So what might that entail? What are the kinds of things that are involved in applying patterns from nature to design organizations? Well, there's the first part, as we learn in kind of land-based ecological design, is we have to know our context. And in this case, that means understanding what we call the social ecosystem. So if you're familiar with kind of maybe more traditional business development, that's kind of familiar in terms of it's like market research. But we really think about it like an ecosystem rather than a machine or a set of, static customers and competitors. It's something that's dynamic. It's something that's always moving. So you might be looking at who are your beneficiaries? Who are you trying to be in symbiosis with? Who are your competitors? Who are your allies? Who are your parasites? What are the kind of larger scale predators that might be trying to bring what you're doing down? And really understanding all of those things. And this part, again, as we learn from nature and learn from permaculture design, this first part is often the most time intensive, is really understanding the context. But once you do understand that context, the next step is to say, what is my role in this ecosystem? What is the role of this organization? What can we do? What is the one thing that we can do amidst all of these different actors to advance that ecosystem towards a greater state of healing and justice and regeneration? What is our niche, right? And then as we identify our niche, part of what that entails is creating connections between ourselves and other people in that ecosystem, whether those are people buying goods and services from us, people who we are in solidarity with. Maybe if we're a nonprofit, maybe those are funders or donors, or other allies who we're partnering with. So whatever it is, it's about creating relationship. Anything in regenerative design is all about creating relationships. So in this case, what are the relationships between our organization and others? So that's the kind of external stuff of what regenerative organizational design might entail. But then there's also a lot of stuff within that organization that you're a part of that can also be really illuminated through this natural systems lens. So there's designing the flows of resources through the organization. Most obviously, that's like the flows of money, right? What is the amount of money that you need to run it? And then how much money are you making and from what sources? But there's also other flows, flows of knowledge, flows of power, flows of culture. And those can also be really thoughtfully designed in an ecological way. And that gets us to the kind of internal dynamics of who are the people in this organization and how do you use ecological and regenerative design frameworks to nurture a thriving team. And I'll share some examples in a little bit of what that might look like. There's governance and decision making. So as a team, how do you make decisions? Is it a hierarchy where one person is in charge and everybody else kind of goes along with that? Or is it are decisions made by consensus or some other way? There's a lot of different really cool and innovative ways of making decisions in groups these days that don't inherit the kind of dysfunction that many of us have grown up with in the way that organizations work. Okay, so patterns of regenerative organizations. These are some themes, some things that often come up in organizations that are using these ecological principles. So it's not like every regenerative organization has these patterns, or some might emphasize them more than others. But this is just to give you a little bit of a tour of like what it actually looks like and feels like in a regenerative organization. Okay, so the first pattern I want to talk about is solidarity. Right. So I mentioned earlier that regenerative organizations, part of what they're doing is restoring justice back to our communities. You know, this is not just about the land, although it's about that too. At least in my perspective, if an organization isn't actively working to heal and dismantle historical oppression and harm, then it's only looking at regenerative from one perspective, and it doesn't mean that that organization has to be its entire purpose or mission is to dismantle colonial structures, but at least there has to be some attention and acknowledgement that probably, you know, the fact that the organization exists in the first place is because of some of those structures, and what can it do to kind of um, give back to communities that have borne the brunt of those exploitative or extractive structures. And so that can look like a lot of different ways, but one thing I just want to name at this point is that, you know, we use the word solidarity very intentionally, and it's different than the word charity, right? The paradigm of charity is that maybe you're kind of giving something back, you're giving a handout, you're making a donation, but solidarity implies that there's a true sense of two-way listening and active participation on the part of marginalized communities or communities who have normally been shut out of power. And that a regenerative organization is really creating the space, creating the conditions for those communities to have power and for them to feel like they are actually being sovereign in determining how you're engaging with them. So that brings us to collaborative leadership. Regenerative organizations generally are ones in which many people are playing a role in helping determine how that organization works. And again, like I said earlier, there's a lot of different ways for that to take place. It doesn't necessarily mean that a regenerative organization is not a traditional hierarchy. In my book, Change Here Now, I talk about the fact that hierarchies are present all over the place in nature, right? They're in the very shape of our veins and our lungs. They're in the watershed. They're in trees, but they serve a very specific purpose. And in many cases, our culture has abused that purpose. But there is such a thing as what I call a consensual hierarchy, where people really consent to having one person be in charge of some things and maybe another person being in charge of another thing. And that can be collaborative as well. And then, of course, there's all kinds of more horizontal forms of leadership too, where you know, different people are more autonomous, but that they're coming together to kind of consent as a group. And so again, there's lots of different ways that this can look like. There's a pattern in ecology called succession. And we recently wrote about this on our Mighty Network. That the way nature works is when there's kind of a blank slate, say after a big forest fire or a flood, that there's certain species that come in and really kind of prepare the soil that other plants can't use. And they make the space safe for others to come in. They create the shade, they create the fertility, the habitat, and that there's this whole series of species that happen at different phases in that cycle until you reach this kind of large, biodiverse, more stable state. And my observation is that the same thing happens in institutions and organizations. At first, there's this initial churn where there's a lot of people coming in and out. There's a lot of turnover. There's a lot of uncertainty about what is it we're actually doing and who are we serving and what's our mission. And that's normal. That's okay. But after time, if you follow these principles, it starts to steady and there's more stability. And then eventually you reach this kind of more stable state. And then, of course, the process starts all over again. There's what we call a disturbance event. Maybe it's something big that happens outside. Maybe it's a leadership change. But either way, then you get the chance, you get the opportunity to renegotiate all those things. There's also succession in leadership. You know, if in many of the organizations I've been a part of, I've done my best to create the conditions as a founder or a leader to make myself obsolete, so that I'm creating an organization that isn't relying on me or any one person, to thrive, but rather it has its own collective intelligence, and that if I leave or if another leader leaves, there's the conditions ready for some other leader to come in and be a replacement. Another really key feature in ecosystems and in regenerative ecosystems that we might design through regenerative landscape design is polycultures, right? So these are intentional groups of species that are working together in a really cohesive way. And so polycultures can also apply to these kinds of organizations. So there are polycultures in programs. I helped start a nonprofit about 12 years ago called the Grow House, which is a food justice organization in North Central Denver. I think there's actually a couple Grow House folks on this call. Hi. So when we started that organization, we intentionally created polycultures in programming so that it wasn't just these different silos of these are the different departments and they're all doing their own thing, but that actually the outputs of one program, like maybe it was extra soil or extra fertilized water from an aquaponics system, became the inputs of another program. And so the success of one program was dependent on the success of another program, and they all needed each other to thrive. And the more one program was thriving, the more they were all thriving. And then there's also polycultures of revenue, how an organization generates income. And generally, it's more resilient, just like in an ecosystem, if you can meet the same need in a bunch of different ways. If an organization can generate its revenue through not just one thing, but two or three connected things, not separate things, but two or three things that all rely on each other and all support each other, that you're going to be in a much more resilient and stable place. So the final pattern I want to share is that regenerative organizations attract abundance. And what I mean by that is that, sometimes we have this idea that unintended consequences are bad. And it's true that so many of the problems in our world today are the unintended negative consequences of really well-intentioned actions, from generations past. But my experience is that when you're operating in this ecological mindset and creating institutions, you actually have unintended consequences all the time. They're just unintended positive consequences. So there's actually things that you never thought of or planned for that start to become attracted to your organization that add to this kind of like snowball that you've created. And it just builds and builds where more people who are really amazing want to devote their time and resources, and more people want to partner. And you have a whole nother income stream that you never even thought of. And that to me is the best way to really know that the way you're operating this organization is in a regenerative way, because indeed, that's what ecosystems do. Ecosystems attract abundance where none exists. That's what they're good at. And that's what we're trying to emulate in our own work. Okay. So,
Adam, before we go to the breakout rooms, just in light of these ecological patterns you've shared, is there any you wanted to loop back to the question about either communications or alternative forms of currency?
yeah, thanks for bringing that back up, Abra. So in terms of the alternative forms of currency, I think that can really relate to what I shared a little bit earlier in terms of organizational design as designing flows, right? And so resource flows, currency can be especially non-state issued currency like dollars or euros or whatever. Those can be really helpful in aligning different flows that maybe a dollar isn't good at serving. So one alternative currency that I'm really active in right now is something that a member of our local community is setting up called Favor. And all it is it's right now just a ledger of people who have done things for other people and how much they've, kind of arbitrarily decided to charge. And then, say if I mow someone's lawn, I get a credit of 30 favor in my account, and they get 30 credits deducted from their account. And so it's a way for, if I accumulate 100 credits, maybe I can get a massage from someone from all my sore shoulders from mowing so many lawns. And that person who's giving me a massage, it's not like I need to have a one-to-one barter exchange with them because it's all captured in this system where we all see exactly how much value we're adding to the system and how much we're getting back in return. And so that's one very simple form of what I call an heirloom currency. There's also, of course, online, there's cryptocurrencies, there are local dollars. And so it's a whole universe that I wish we had more time to go into, but that's just one example of how you can do that in an institution, and apply those kinds of things to have more harmonious resource flows than that kind of scarcity that the dollar economy often forces us into. And then the other question around communication, I think, again, that's part of nurturing a thriving and trusting team and shared governance. I think one thing I'll just share briefly about that is, I think regenerative organizations are ones where the individuals within that organization don't feel like they have to hold anything back from who they are as their authentic selves. It doesn't mean we're just like oversharing and like saying things that, TMI for work. But what it does mean is that if there's something I need to say to you, or if there's some kind of tension among us, that I don't feel like I'm not allowed to share that there's this what I call the relational soil that has been built over some very intentional conversations over time that allows the people within that group to feel comfortable bringing up conflict, because as Malidoma Somé says, conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen. Conflict is not a bad thing. It's about how we respond to conflict, how we relate to it, that can either make it erosive to our culture or actually healing and generative. Okay, so I know that was a lot that I shared. I would love to give you all the chance to kind of metabolize and compost some of this nutrients that I've been throwing your way. Abra just put the prompt in the chat window. The first question is, think of a time when one of these things I named was notably present or absent in an organization you've been a part of. And then really lean into, how did it feel for you as a member of that organization? What did it feel like in your body? What were the emotions that came up, either in a good way or in a not so good way? So we've just been talking about, what does regenerative organizational design entail? What are some of the patterns that often show up? And we don't have time today to actually talk about how do you literally go about designing a regenerative organization. But we would love to explore that with you in the future. And something we are just going to share very briefly is this framework that really kind of captures the essence of so much of my work over the past decade, as well as a lot of Abra's wisdom, that we're calling the Regenerative Social Design Canvas. And it kind of combines aspects of something called the business model canvas, as well as the permaculture and regenerative design processes, into this spiral that is interactive. So this is something called a Prezi, where you can zoom in on different parts of this spiral, and each step is a different step in the design process. And then each one of these has different activities that you can apply to an organization or an initiative that you're a part of. And so in some upcoming offerings that I'm going to share shortly, we're going to be going through this spiral and sharing the whole thing with you, where you can actually be guided through a journey of regenerative social design, using this as an interactive tool that then you can kind of return to over and over again for your future work. So we have, like I mentioned, coming up a workshop. So in Friday, May 21st, in just a couple weeks, I'm going to be leading a 2.5-hour workshop on organizational design frameworks. And so that's really where we're going to be getting into that spiral that I just shared and talking about what are all those steps. How do all of the things I've talked about today on the webinar, where do they plug into that spiral? And as with all our offerings, that's going to be offered on a sliding scale. There's multiple tiers for registration. And then if you really want to dive deep, I would love for you all to join me in the Organizational Design Intensive. So that's a 6-week online course that happens for 2 hours a week every Thursday from May 27th to July 1st. And there's going to be an online community as part of that, where we can talk and support each other in between those Thursdays. And there's going to be lots of interactive activities and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And then in addition to those two kind of group offerings, we offer resourcing and consulting. So if you're interested in just having a little bit more one-on-one time with myself or Abra or anybody else on the Regenerate Change team, you can find out about that on our website. And that brings us to ways to stay connected with what we're up to at Regenerate Change. So we're on Facebook and Instagram at Regenerate Change, posting some really juicy stuff on there. Our website is regeneratechange.com, where you can find out about upcoming workshops, about our consulting and resourcing. Both Abra and I have books, and you can get some free downloads of excerpts of those books on our website. We have an email newsletter that comes out on the new moon and the full moon, with some really juicy learnings and wisdom, as well as info about stuff we have going on. And then last but certainly not least, there's our Regenerative Changemakers Network that I mentioned, which is kind of our online hub for our growing community. There's already over 250 people on there. We're having great conversations on an ongoing basis about regenerative social design and how to apply it to our lives. We are having a Changemakers chat that's going to happen every month, the first one starting in June. And that's a big event like this, but a lot more informal and just an opportunity for us to all connect and hang out and learn more about each other. So if not beforehand, would certainly love to see you at that.